to do a welcome. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here for our third presentation for the DNC, for the SPR DNC speaker series. Today we're dedicating our presentation in celebration of National Hispanic Heritage Month. And so today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Felipe Castro, and he's been kind enough to let me share the spotlight with him for this afternoon. Just to let you know, we will be recording today's session. And for the most part, we really think today's presentation is going to be more of a conversation between Dr. Castro and myself, where we're going to share some of our reflections throughout our career paths in academia, discuss some of the challenges as Hispanic researchers who focus on prevention science or public health research with Hispanic communities. We also plan to talk about provide some strategies for career development and also some growth areas for the field of prevention science. And I think through our discussion, you'll probably pick up on some potential generational differences and similarities as we go and chat about our respective career paths in academia. So like I said, it's mainly going to be, you could think of it as a discussion format. And so hopefully we should have plenty of time at the end to answer questions and answers. But if you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to include them in the chat box, and we'll start reviewing those as we begin. So we're going to start with a brief introduction from Dr. Felipe Castro and then myself. And really the purpose of this is just to kind of to give you some background or some context as far as who we are, where we come from. So again, I think that this will again provide more of a richer context as we go through our discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Castro for his personal introduction.
Okay, thank you, Miguel and Jennifer. It's such a pleasure to be here and to share my life experiences with various levels of academic progress or professional progress in each of you. I sincerely hope that some of these sharing of ideas will be an important contribution to your own career trajectory. In relation to mine, some of those questions will be answered in my answers to the questions that you'll have. But I'm really an immigrant from Mexico, born in Mexico City, and my family came to the United States when I was 3 years old. So I really grew up in the Los Angeles area as a bilingual, bicultural individual. And so I'll share some of those experiences and insights as well. My PhD is from the University of Washington in Seattle. And previous to that, I have an MSW degree in psychiatric social work from UCLA. And also before that, I went to UC Santa Barbara for a bachelor's degree in psychology, experimental psychology to be exact. So that's a little bit of my background. In terms of places of employment, my first job was at UCLA Department of Psychology, a very prestigious and very tough place to be, but it was an 8-year postdoc as far as I'm concerned. Other places of my employment have been San Diego State University in the Graduate College of Public Health, and then here at ASU for 20 years, then went to El Paso to head their health psychology program. And I'm pleased to be back here at ASU now in the College of Nursing and Health Innovation at the downtown campus. So that's a little bit about myself, and you'll hear a little bit more as I answer the questions, as well as in collaboration with Miguel, who is, I will say to you, started some of his career in the Department of Psychology at ASU. And so he was in my lab, and I'm so proud that he is now, of course, one of us as faculty, of course, there in Florida. With that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Cano himself.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. So first, let me begin by saying it really is an honor to be presenting with you, Dr. Castro, and I think I'll share some of this in some of our conversation. But I really credit Dr. Castro for kind of opening this career path to me as far as going into prevention science, public health, focusing in Hispanic communities. Again, I consider him my very first mentor. And so again, I remember him, I think I met him at ASU when I was about 20. And I just celebrated my 40th this past weekend. So it's been a pleasure to connect with Felipe, at that stage of my career, because I credit him for where I'm at now. So a little bit about my background. I'm Mexican American. I was born in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm the son of immigrants. I was you can I think of myself as a first generation high school graduate and subsequently a first generation college student and graduate. I attended Arizona State for my bachelor's, where I majored in psychology, minored in Chicano studies, which is Mexican American studies, and sociology. And as Dr. Castro mentioned, that was really my introduction to research focusing on cultural determinants of substance use. Later on, I transitioned to Texas A&M for a PhD in counseling psychology, and along the way, I got a master's in public health. I did a postdoc. I was fortunate to do a postdoc in health disparities research at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. And for about the past 6-7 years, I've really enjoyed my time here in the Department of Epidemiology at Florida International University, which is in Miami. So I think, again, that kind of provides a general overview of what we've done and who we are. And so we'll jump in right into our questions. So I'll ask this question first of Dr. Castro. So given that you were raised in a low-income Hispanic community in Los Angeles, what influenced your aspirations to go into college and subsequently pursue a career in academia?
That's such a lifelong question, and it's hard to say that one thing did it, but I must say it began at the very beginning. Some people would not really believe that this is true, but it is true for me, and I think it's absolutely true. I remember my very first day of kindergarten. I didn't even know I was going to school, although I had been taken to that environment to get used to it. I thought it was a playground. And when I was playing in the playground, my mother was trying to slip away so that I wouldn't be frightened that she wasn't there. But she saw that I saw her leaving, and she said, "Stay there, everything will be okay." And I thought to myself, that's fine with me, because I was so excited about school. This is school. There were other kids, there were toys, there was crayons, finger painting. I mean, it was like a playground. Why wouldn't I want to go to school? But in addition to that, it really was learning. And, not all kids have this, and that's okay. But I loved learning, and I'm still in school. I'm still learning now, and I enjoy it and want to continue as long as my health holds up and that I can be a contributor. So that was the influence. Of course, there were others later. Just to mention briefly, I used to go to the library regularly, and I loved discovery of all the books that were there. But what started my interest in college was the UCLA-USC rivalry. You'd see it on TV and football, and that was part of the university. And I thought, wow, that would be neat to go there too and go to all these games. Notwithstanding that I didn't go to that many because I was too busy preparing for classes and research, but that's okay. And then finally, the possibility of actually becoming a professor came when I was at doing my clinical psychology internship at the old UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, and I applied for 2 jobs. I didn't get the one I thought I'd get, which was on associate director of the clinic, but I did get assistant professor in a full tenure track position, and that was the start of my career. I'm sure there are other views, and Dr. Cano, what are your thoughts about this?
Sure. So I can share a little bit about my I guess, initial route to where I'm at. So, interestingly, I would say going to college was kind of, I guess, a no-brainer for me, which in retrospect is interesting because I actually was held back in first grade because I couldn't speak English. So I grew up in a very traditional Mexican family. My parents at that time didn't know very much English. And so, there was no need to learn English, growing up at home. And so, it took me a while to grasp the English language. And so, I think maybe by the standard, if I could ask everybody to please mute your microphone, please. So, I think at that point, by maybe the standards of a lot of people, perhaps the expectations weren't particularly high for me, having flunked first grade. But again, I was very fortunate having very supportive parents. And so I never really saw any limitations in going to college. And so again, I'm very grateful to my parents for that. As far as the pursuit to academia, it's, I was always interested in issues of social justice. In high school, I was a member of my high school chapter of MECHA, which is an activist student organization focusing on issues of social justice. And initially what I was really drawn to were disparities in education among Hispanic communities. But then when I transitioned to Arizona State, again, keeping a foot in sociology and Chicano studies, I was still trying to figure out, how I could potentially pursue a career, related to that, because that was always something that I was drawn to. I didn't quite figure it out, I would say, up until you and I crossed paths, and I knocked on your door, and really just being, to me, it was an eye opener, realizing the type of research that was being conducted, focusing on health and the way that different social factors and cultural factors influenced health. And so for me, that was really one of the things that kind of clicked in recognizing that science, psychology could really serve as a tool and a mechanism to address major social problems and ultimately, issues of social justice. So with that, we'll transition to our next question. How did your culture influence the types of research you conducted and the approaches taken in that research?
Yes, it goes back to, I guess, identity is a key factor here. Since I was 3, but primarily around 4, 5, 6 years old, began to become fairly balanced bilingual. And so it was really fascinating to me to think in 2 languages and to code switch back and forth. Interestingly enough, as Miguel had in his family life, my parents primarily spoke only Spanish. So at home, I spoke to them in Spanish, and it would be strange to speak to them in English. But amongst my siblings, we were bilingual. And as the younger ones came, they were more English oriented. But the point is, it was really fascinating to be able to see differing worldviews and to do research to figure out how worldviews were the same or different. And so that was the basis for my first study, which was titled The Health Beliefs of Mexican, Mexican-American, and Anglo-American Women. And in that sample, I was interested in how much they would endorse beliefs or knowledge in science versus those that came from folk beliefs and other types of illnesses that were considered folk belief-like. And what I found there, and it was as a function of levels of acculturation, what I found is that the scientific thinking didn't differ across groups, but those that were more folk and culturally based did differ significantly by acculturation level. And that was the beginning of this interest in understanding from a scientific perspective, the human condition. And so as a result, there was a lot of interest in other work. Ironically enough, 35 years later, after my publication in 1984, now we just got an R01 to continue work in this very vein. And that one is diabetes prevention in Latino populations, Latino families rather, awarded by NIDDK. And in that one, there's a deeper dive in understanding family structures and especially the process by which they learn and can begin to incorporate prevention ideas and approaches and behaviors towards reducing their risk of developing diabetes. And so in some ways, although I've had different threads that I can mention later in my research, it has had that common thread of unifying science and culture as very important. Because in general, I felt science was so special because you wanted to find out the factors that influenced the universe. And then after that, of course, is what makes people think as they do, understanding variation that came with cultural differences or even within cultural variation. So this confluence has been a major thread in my research across now. This is my 40th year as a university professor. It's hard to believe it, but on the other hand, I see those threats. Miguel, how about for you?
Sure. So actually, Doctor, I had a follow-up question for you. So, I think you're definitely one of the leaders in mixed methods. So one thing that's come to mind, I think a lot of the things that we study, whether it be acculturation, ethnic identity, different tradition, gender roles or cultural attitudes, that they're fairly complex and sometimes quite abstract. I wonder if, the nature of some of the things that we study were a key factor that drew you into mixed methods and incorporating qualitative research.
Well, absolutely. Going back to my first study, in those days, early 80s, there weren't scales to measure this. They weren't very good, even if they were available. And so I started developing my own scales to measure things. But I also asked open-ended questions in that first study that was conducted with women at the First Street Clinic in East Los Angeles. I published the article based on the quantitative data, but the most interesting part, and that was the beginning of an inkling of the need for mixed methods, were the qualitative answers that the women gave. As an example, I may say, do you believe in susto? And then they would have high ranking of belief. Oh yeah, that's like a fright. And then I would say, well, what about the Caída de la Mollera, fallen fontanelle, or others? And then some women would say, oh no, that's an old wives' tale. And it began to give me the idea, well, I thought they would automatically believe the other. And it led to thinking, we need to get the qualitative in tandem with the quantitative so we can triangulate and then understand the deeper process by which some things are part of their cognitive schema, but others are not. So it was an early rendition of mixed methods until we taught mixed methods to a summer workshop in 1996 for one of the national agencies that wanted to promote more upward mobility into academia. So there were some early roots to that. But there again, I think mixed methods has really blossomed and there's more work needed, especially because cultural issues were hard to capture by measurement alone. You needed that storytelling that gave the nuances and complex issues that are what we consider culture.
Thanks. You know, so before I get to my thoughts on this question, I was just thinking actually still on the first question. You know, I think if you're looking for an example of benefits of increasing the representation of underrepresented groups, in this case, Latinos in academia and science, I think the relationship that you and I have is definitely one of those examples of the benefits. Because again, I think having faces that are Latino familiar like yours and doing research in the communities that we live in was definitely a big pull for me to pursue the career that I'm in now. So again, I think that really speaks to the importance of increasing the representation of racial ethnic minorities that unfortunately currently, you know, aren't well represented in academia and in a lot of sciences. Related to this question, you know, I would say my Hispanic culture has influenced my work tremendously. I feel like I have insider information. So I think I use a lot of introspection throughout my career, and I continue to do so, reflecting on my own experiences or observations that I see in my community or my family, which is really, you know, whether it be anecdotal, really then taking those ideas and testing them, you know, getting data to see if, you know, if these are, you know, unique experiences for me or my family, or do other people experience those things as well? So, you know, one thing that's come to mind and an example I've shared with you, Dr. Castro, you know, having grown up in the Southwest, bouncing between Texas and Arizona, you know, it's a certain lifestyle that's very different to living in South Florida, which is a very rich and diverse community of Hispanics. And so, you know, I think being here to me was an eye-opener in a lot of things. And one of the things that I experienced was kind of within group discrimination among Hispanics. Again, in other places where you're the minority, I think there's a tendency to gravitate and believe in the idea of their strength in numbers and really gravitating to, you know, some of these pan-ethnic terms, you know, Hispanic, Latinx. But here, there's really no need for that because, again, there's a lot of representation from different Hispanic subgroups and nationalities. And so, again, that's now led, you know, inform my research in trying to develop measures, you know, to better capture intragroup experiences of how we treat each other and how potentially that influence our work again. And I also credit, you know, some of that influence in working with my previous mentor, Dr. Castillo, who, again, I think she you know, initiated some of this work in creating a measure of intragroup marginalization. Again, kind of capturing a little bit more, you know, when we think about acculturation or cultural stressors, a lot of times we think about stressors associated with experiences in adapting to the US receiving culture. Again, I think now as I've continued my program of research, keeping in mind that as you acculturate, that also has consequences with your own family and how you're perceived and viewed. and how might that influence sources of social support and ultimately health outcomes?
Sure, absolutely. There is within group variation and excuse me, discrimination based upon these sectors that are definitely there. And some sectors work very well together, others are in competition or conflict. And it's stratified by generation, by political preferences, by religious background, et cetera. So there's a lot of within group variations that really need to be studied and understood better.
Thank you. So our next question, what are challenges you have experienced as a Hispanic scientist who conducts research on Hispanic issues?
Well, you know, one of the things that came up in my interview, actually job interview, when I got my first job, before that, of course, was the notion, are you a Latino or Hispanic scientist, or are you a scientist that happens to be Latino Hispanic? And I'm not sure how I answered that question. I felt that the science came first, but I was not about to say, well, but I don't want to do anything with my culture, because I've always been proud of that. But the challenge was the following. In those days, and perhaps to some extent now, there were the mainstream APA journals, which of course was where we should be publishing, but there was not as much on cultural and other ethnic issues then as it is now. And there were less specialty journals, so there were just very few. And the idea was, if you published in a specialty journal, well, you got a publication. It ain't the same as the APA journal. And so there was the conundrum of, how do I do both? And then the answer is, do both. And so I experienced that and began to publish in both, because that's what was required in order to obtain promotion and tenure. So in some ways, that was a good thing to do. And to this day, I find that different strands that are complementary are really important. In my early career, the strands were Hispanic mental health and structural equation model analysis in looking at drug use etiology. And so different mentors provided that feedback, and I'm grateful for that. Mid-career, it was drug abuse prevention and treatment, looking deeper into those, and then health promotion in Latino populations, looking at chronic degenerative diseases. And now in this stage, actually there's 3 strands. Actually there's 4, but I'll mention one more too. The integrative mixed methods approach, so it's a methodological approach to doing a variety of research studies. Of course, the substantive focus is diabetes prevention with Latino Hispanic families, but quite a bit of work has been done in the cultural adaptation of preventive interventions. And so there are these strands, but they do differ to some extent. And the last one, even in my lab, I still have 2 strands. One is diabetes prevention, and the other is stress coping and resilience. And there are some overlaps there. So either I can't just focus because I have to do more than one thing, but I think more than that, it was strategic. Because if funding was not so good in one area, I had another area that I could draw from. And that has served me well through the years. So that's kind of the issue. One limitation, I think, is that early in my career, and perhaps not so much now, I was typecast. And so apparently the only thing I knew about and could do was to do research on acculturation with Latinos. And I felt that, well, but I do other things too. But it seemed as though that was the only thing folks, so if they needed some help in that area, they would contact me. But through the years, it's changed, although again, it's important to have that diversification for a variety of reasons. And I think in due time, it has changed, because now I'm known for other things than just that one area.
Yeah, thank you, Felipe. You know, as I was thinking about this question, and even in some of our discussions in preparing for this presentation, I think this question kind of is probably the one that lends itself to tap or assess a little bit more generational differences or similarities. So I think, you know, for as far as challenges, one of the challenges I've encountered is still there's, you know, certain individuals who might not necessarily value research that focus primarily on a particular racial or ethnic group. In this case, for me, focusing on Hispanic communities. And still, you know, some folks being somewhat discouraging of focusing on these groups. So, you know, to me, that's been a challenge, you know, still trying to get buy-in from certain individuals or institutions where, you know, as I reflect on my experiences, I imagine that was magnified much more when you were conducting your training and you were an early stage investigator again. Now, we have an entire institute in NIH devoted to minority health and health disparities. We have, an abundance of journals that focus on issues of culture and health disparities. Where, I assume this was not the case, when you were, starting your career. So, I'm actually curious to see how you were able to overcome some of those challenges, considering the challenges were a little bit steeper.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think, and it goes into another question will come up, but it's good to mention that now. I always felt that you have to be very centered with yourself, and that's not easy as you start your career and you get rejections in proposals and journals, and even some colleagues, they would be indirectly, not everyone, some people value it, others would be disparaging. That's not real psychological science. And the notion was, well, no, you have to be true to yourself, and you have to gain and develop, but ultimately maintain that centeredness that says, well, that's that person's erroneous opinion. I believe in what I do. I'm going to do it. And in fact, I'm going to try to be the best I can be. And I think that attitude was very important in plowing through some of those limitations of the past. But now, yes, it's really great that there are so many journals now that allow you to express those views, and they're central to the mission of that journal. But it's always nice to be able to toggle back and forth. Again, the bilingual, bicultural identity, to do the specific scientific study that has minority, or rather racial ethnic issues as a part of it. And those where racial ethnic issues are a central core of the issues to be examined. And I find it comfortable to go back and forth. It just depends on the research question and what has to be said based upon what evidence accrues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. The other thing that comes to mind, and maybe I'm assuming you've experienced this as well, in certain environments, I do feel there's an added pressure being Latino or Hispanic, because oftentimes you might be the only person from that background. You might be the only particular person at a meeting, a review panel. And so there is, I don't know if I would say stressful, but I do feel conscious of that in those moments where, you might be, what you say or what you do might not just be a reflection of you, but certain people might take it and make it, you're speaking on behalf of Latinos, or you're a representation of Latinos. And so for that moment, what you do might have consequences, because again, unfortunately, I feel certain individuals might, make gross assumptions of, the way you carry yourself or conduct yourself and generalize it to Hispanics in general.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And, I'm proud to be a representative of Latinos, Hispanics in the work that I do. And even then, I don't represent everybody at a certain sector, but it's hard to be the representative of over 60 million people and to be their spokesperson. That just is not in the cards, because there's so many sectors within the population. Mm-hmm. And some people may see me as someone who would emulate the kind of person they would like to be, and that's really great. But other people may say, I don't want to be that way, because they don't do the profession, or they don't make the money, or they don't do whatever that I want to do. And so I don't even identify with that person. In fact, I don't even want to be seen as a Latino. And those are personal choices. I don't disparage those. But in my case, obviously, I can represent some and not others. But the other part, which is absolutely true, there's an adage in Latino cultures in Spanish, pórtese bien, which means mind your manners, because mm-hmm. It's so important to really opening up and doors and being with people. And I think if there's a few universals, one of them is respeto, and that's also at least a Mexican adage coming from one of the presidents, Benito Juarez, in the times of the Civil War in the US and in Mexico in the 1860s. And he said, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz. Respect of the foreign rights of others is peace. And I thought that captures a lot. And so trying to do that, sometimes difficult, is important. But it goes down to being the best you can be. And some people will really appreciate that. Others will say, I don't value those things. And well, that's life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So moving on to our fourth question. Um, from a mentorship perspective, what observations have you provided your students who aspire to pursue successful careers in public health, prevention science research, who focus on Hispanic populations?
But you know, this I want to tell a little story, an incident that captures some of these. And it came when I was in the mailroom in Department of Psychology at UCLA. And one of the professors was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. And he's Latino, John Garcia. And he was, in those days, it was called physiological psych. Now it's behavioral neuroscience. But he did what was called the Garcia effect, that he found that rats, how come rats don't get poisoned all the time? They're eating all kinds of toxic substances. They had a taste aversion wired in somehow. And so they avoided getting poisoned, but they were able to eat all kinds of stuff at night through whatever means. And that's how they survived. Well, he wanted to teach me a few things, but he wasn't in my area. But one time he said, how would you like to get tenured? And I said, of course, that's what I'm working for all these years. And he says, well, get an offer from Stanford or from Yale or Harvard, you'll get tenured right away. And you know what? A case came up just like that, promotion from associate to full, and that person got tenured right away because Stanford wanted to hire them. And that thing was either we promote her or she's gone. But then the other part of the story that I want to say is that one day he comes up and he says, Felipe, in this business, success is based on two things: intelligence and thick skin. And then he walks away like that was it. And then he comes back and he looked around like he didn't want anybody to find out that he told me this top secret in academia or he's going to be in big trouble. And then he says, and thick skin is more important. And then he walks away.
Yeah.
And I took it to heart. True, you must have that. And how you express it and how you do it, those need to be developed. But I think it's very important because in our profession, in academia, standards are high, you get a lot of rejection, you gotta bounce back. And lo and behold, that is at least the basic metaphor of resilience. You find a way to bounce back. And I've been lucky because I've been able to bounce back, not entirely by myself, but with others too. So I say that story to folks to give them the idea, not easy, but you have to be centered and others can help you, but you must have that. The other thing, which is a little bit more, a little different, is the pride that you have in your heritage. Mine being Latino, Mexican, I have that pride, but I'm also very proud to be American. You don't have to give one up for the other. And it's this bicultural identity, which is important. But the last one, I think, is more substantive to the academic pursuit. And that has to do with a genuine dedication for scholarly mastery of your content area. There's a lot to be said about building that capacity, that you are able to really discuss with nuance and great detail an issue from different approaches, whether theoretical or different research questions, to get to the point where you are definitely top flight in that area. And there are a few questions you don't know or can't answer, although there's so many areas and side areas you work in, you can't be top in everything. But the goal is having such a strong command of your material that you're able to address things. But that also requires constant finding out what the latest is, because fields are changing so fast, you need to do that too. But these are some background ideas that I give, not as advice, but as just experiences. And I love the motivational interviewing adage that says, we're going to put everything on the table, take what you need and leave the rest. And by doing that, I put things on the table for students, mentees, early career colleagues. They can choose what works for them. But as long as something does, I'm happy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Felipe. So I think I'm going to piggyback off of one of them, the thick skin. And I think it also relates to one of the challenges I shared, earlier in the previous question, as far as some folks, somewhat being, trying to discourage you in your path to focus on public health research with Hispanic populations. So I think, you have to be true to yourself. In the position I've been now as faculty, I've worked with PhD students, and unfortunately I've encountered PhD students who have come, and met with me, and they've been upset. They're upset because, they met with another researcher or another faculty member, and they might have explicitly discourage them to change their topic. Why you're focusing on Hispanics? That's such a small, yeah, that's like a niche field, or just really not being, not valuing the work that's being done. So I would say again, if that's what drew you into a career in prevention science or public health, is to help your community or Hispanic communities, stay true to that. You have to be resilient. You have to believe in yourself. And again, as Dr. Castro mentioned, if put something on the table and if it's not helpful to you, you leave it there. And so again, keep in mind that's the opinion of one person or a few people. But on the flip side, there's a lot of people who do believe in focusing on public health research focused on Hispanic communities and see tremendous value and benefit to focusing on this particular group. So again, I think you have to sometimes be your own cheerleader and remind yourself of why you got into what you're doing. Again, as Dr. Castro mentioned, I think we're in a business where rejection is the norm, whether it's grants or papers. And so you do grow accustomed to it. So I think you do have to remind yourself, did you get into this for, to get an R01 or to publish a paper in, prevention science or APHA? Or did you get into this business to help your community be better, be stronger? And if that's your goal, I think that's going to be fuel that's going to keep you motivated and working through the tough times. So some other things that I think they're a little bit more general, maybe not specific to research in Hispanic populations, but I think particularly in working with students or early career investigators from underrepresented backgrounds, there's a tendency to be a little bit more shy or hesitant to ask for what you need. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, it's very important to be proactive, particularly when it comes to networking. So again, I think that there's tremendous benefits to being proactive in networking. Again, you get career advice and input from, an array of people, as opposed, we're very fortunate to be in an era where you're not limited to, networking or, getting advice from the faculty, the people that at your institution. I mean, you can reach out nationally. Again, as an early career individual, we're all looking for data. We don't, a lot of times we don't have data or that preliminary data for that grant. And so again, this is why it's important to be proactive. And if you're shy, you need to put that shyness away for a bit and literally just, set up a meeting with individuals that you think are doing quality work. Try to meet with them at conferences. I think these are, there's tremendous benefit to being proactive and enhancing your professional network. And then lastly, I think with the issue of respect, I think that's key. I think that sounds simple, but being a graduate program director at my institution and working with a lot of PhD students, I'm surprised, how again, just basic manners or respect for individuals sometimes goes out the window. And again, people have they have long-term memories that they'll remember those things. And at the end of the day, our professional networks are pretty small. So again, there's consequences for the way that you talk to people or treat people. So again, it seems like very basic advice, but I think it's unfortunately advice that some people still need to hear.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I've been on many hiring committees, and not only is the academic acumen really important and the history of publications and money getting, but the character. And many units don't want to bring someone who is a big star, but is a disruptive force in their local ecology. And so there are times when that issue comes up and faculty will discuss it, yay or nay. So your reputation really does count. That happened to me when I was being recruited to here to ASU, and my first charge would be running the Hispanic Research Center. And years later, one of the colleagues from psychology said, I'll share this with you. And they were interested in how you conduct yourself with different faculty. And they wanted to make sure that you were going to be equitable and that you wanted to work well with men and women. And so she said, I gave you a good a good response, or I gave them a good response. I was happy. She didn't have to say that to me, but she wanted just to share that without any of other confidential content. But it was an important affirmation that the effort to try to do these things well, at least was recognized by some. And so that reputation is really important.
Thank you, Felipe. So this is our final question, I believe. What do you consider to be growth areas in the field of prevention science as applied with Hispanic communities?
All right. I have three that I identified, but those are specific to my own interests, and there's probably others, although these do center in the prevention science arena. The first of this, I really do think we need to do more work within population sectors, as we've discussed before, because many interventions really need to be tailored for some unique features that are within a group, but certainly that group is so different from that same racial ethnic group, but in other parts of the country or in different environments. And so that needs to be done in order to avoid also interventions that are not going to catch on with that group. In other words, it won't really resonate. One example was in a drug prevention intervention, and the kids here in the Phoenix area, being more metropolitan, were in those days doing breakdancing. And then but when exported to a rural community in other parts of the country, that just didn't catch on. So they had to do more, line dancing or other things, small things, but they changed the acceptability of the intervention. So that's important. The other, which is needs further design development, but the notion of multi-level interventions. The issue is the following. We do a lot in drug prevention with adolescents in order to teach them refusal skills. But one of the challenges is the refusal skills are good, but they may also have to be supported by structural changes in the local community. The example being tobacco prevention, which we did years ago, but also needing to reduce the availability of tobacco placement, where kids could go into the store and boxes of cigarettes were just lying around there close to the entrance, so they could conveniently walk out with 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes. So those are an old example, but the idea is we need to have more in the ecological framework, the ecosystemic framework, 3 levels. Of course, what we do a lot of is the micro level, meaning individuals and families, and some at the school level might be seen as meso. Those need to be extended to community. And then, of course, there's also compatible interventions at the macro level, policy. All these are important parts. And the goal would be to create synergy between 2 parts of one intervention or 2 parallel interventions that begin to add more strength to our capacity to make these differences. So there's a lot more there, but I think that that's an important future approach. And finally, I want to put in a pitch for developing with families and communities a culture of health. That is, Robert Johnson has pioneered this, and I think we need more of that. The awareness that health is so important in our lives, and yet there are challenges at different levels to that. But to the extent that we can build family health consciousness and ways to have healthier lifestyles, such as in diabetes prevention and in other areas, is really important, because we need to promote that in order to get them started and then excited and interested in continuing to move in the healthy direction, because we have so many forces, factors, TV ads, whatever, that are not healthy and even addictive, from social media to drugs themselves. So we need to provide some interventions that will promote that at different levels, including the meso and macro level, meaning policies themselves. So those are 3 areas. There are certainly many, but those are 3 that I think are very important, and they are centered in what we can do in prevention science. Well, in fact, one thing I wanted to mention before, I wanted to mention that part of that is affiliating our prevention science in connection with culturally responsive public health approaches, but also with implementation science. And that, of course, is a theme for next year's conference. So I certainly believe that's in the right direction. And those alliances for multidisciplinary teams to work together, I think are the area of the future.
Thank you, Felipe. So a couple of things that came to mind as I thought about this question. I actually think that there's still, and some people I feel might disagree with this one. There's still a need for more ideological or observational studies focusing on diverse Hispanic communities. But I would say, that ideally, that there should be longitudinal studies and theory-driven. Again, this makes, probably people saying, well, that's a no-brainer. But I really do think, currently in the state of there's still big gaps in integrating, frameworks of social determinants of health and applying them or integrating them with other conceptual models that are specific to particular health outcomes or health behaviors. So again, thinking about the work I do in substance use, again, integrating conceptual models of social determinants of health with models of addiction. Surprisingly, I think that there's still a disconnect, in successfully integrating some of these models, where we're looking at perhaps more proximal predictors of substance use or substance use disorders and how they might be mechanisms or, there might be cultural, social moderators that impact, some of these more proximal predictors. So again, I think that that's still an area of growth. Another one, again, I'm a little bit biased because I've had a long-term interest in emerging adulthood. I do think emerging adulthood is a very interesting time period, considering that you see a lot of health risk behaviors and problems with mental health. But I do think in general, the concept of emerging adulthood has kind of been developed and continues to be seen more through, I guess you could say like a white Eurocentric lens. And I think some of the concepts or the ideas of emerging adulthood are a little bit different for Hispanic individuals. So I think we need to give some consideration at looking at emerging adulthood and health outcomes and looking at it more through a cultural lens that's applicable to Hispanic emerging adults. I still think there's a need for better measures. I think there's still certain constructs that are relevant to Latino health that we haven't developed particularly well or that they're oversimplified. So I think there's still room for that. And then just lastly, I think just as with most fields in public health, I'm sure at some point there's still going to be a need and we'll see more developments in using big data and machine learning. But with that, I think that concludes our questions that we had for each other in our discussion. So with that, we can open it up for questions from the audience.